Chapter 4 of Rainy Week by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gemma. Chapter 4. Sleep is a funny thing. Really comical, I mean. A magician's trick. Now you have it, and now you don't. Certainly I had very little of it the night of Dr. Braun's telephone conversation. I was too surprised. Yet, staring up through those long, wakeful hours into the jetty black heights of my bedroom ceiling, it didn't seem to be so much the conversation itself as the perfectly irrelevant events succeeding that conversation that kept hurtling back so into my visual consciousness. The blueness of the May girl's eyes, the brightness of her hair, Rollins' necktie, the perfectly wanton hideousness of Rollins's necktie, the bang, bang, bang of a storm-tortured shutter way off in the L somewhere. Step by step, item by item, each detail of events reprinted itself on my mind. Fumbling back from the shadowy telephone stand into the brightly lighted upper hall with the single desire to find my husband and confide to him as expeditiously as possible this news which had so amazed me, I had stumbled instead upon the May girl herself, climbing somewhat listlessly up the stairs toward bed. Rollins was close behind her, carrying her book and a filmy sky-blue scarf. George Keats followed with a pitcher of water. "Oh, it's good night, dear, is it?" I questioned. "Yes," said the May girl. "I'm pretty tired." She certainly looked it. Rollins, quite evidently, was in despair. He was not to accomplish his kiss, after all, it would seem. All the long day I had judged he'd been whipping up his cheeky courage to meet some magic opportunity of the evening. And now, it appeared, there wasn't going to be any evening. Even the last precious moment indeed was to be ruined by George Keats's perfidious intrusion. It was the bride's voice, though, that rang down the actual curtain on Rollins's perfect day. "Oh, Miss Davies, Miss Davies," called the bride, "you mustn't forget to return your ring, you know." "Why, no, so I mustn't," rallied the May girl. Twice I heard Rollins swallow very hard. Any antique was sacred to him, but a family antique, oh, ye gods! "Keep the ring," stammered Rollins. It was the nearest point to real heroism, surely, that funny little Rollins would ever attain. "Oh, no, indeed," protested the May girl. Very definitely she snapped the silken threads, removed the clumsy bauble from her finger, and handed it back to Rollins. But it's a beautiful ring," she hastened chivalrously to assure him. I'll keep the orchids," she assented with real dimples. On Rollins's sweating face the symptoms of acute collapse showed suddenly. With a glare that would have annihilated a less robust soul than George Keats's, he turned and laid bare his horrid secret to an unfeeling public. "I'd rather you kept the ring," sweated Rollins. The orchids have got to go back. I only hired the orchids. That is, I bribed the gardener. They've got to be back by 9 o'clock tonight for some sort of a party." "Tonight?" I gasped. "In all this storm? Why, what if the May girl had refused to—" In Rollins's small, blinking eyes, romance and thrift battled together in terrible combat. "I gotta go back," mumbled Rollins. "He's got my watch." "Oh, for goodness sake, you mustn't risk losing your watch," laughed the May girl. George Keats didn't laugh. He hooted. I had never heard him hoot before, and ribald as the sound seemed emanating from his distinctly austere lips, the mechanical construction of that hoot was in some way strangely becoming to him. The May girl, quite frankly, though, was afraid he had hurt Rollins's feelings. Returning swiftly from her bedroom with the lovely exotics bunched cautiously in one hand, she turned an extravagantly tender smile on Rollins's unhappy face. Just one of them," she apologized, "is crushed a little. I know you told me to be awfully careful of them. I'm very sorry, but truly," she smiled, "it's been perfectly wonderful. Just to have them for a day. Thank you. Thank you a whole lot, I mean. And for the day itself. It's been very pleasant," she lied gallantly. Snatching the orchids almost roughly from her hand, Rollins gave another glare at George Keats and started for his own room. With his fingers on the door-handle, he turned and glared back with particular ferocity at the May-girl herself. "Pleasant," he scoffed. "Pleasant!" And crossing the threshold, he slammed the door hard behind him. Never had I seen anything more boorish. Why, how tired he must be!" exclaimed the May-girl. "Tired?" hooted George Keats. He was still hooting when he joined the bride and bridegroom in the library. It must have been 15 minutes later that, returning from an investigation of the banging blind, I ran into Rollins stealing surreptitiously to the May-girl's door. Quite unconsciously, doubtless, but with most rapacious effect, his sparse hair was rumpled in innumerable directions, and the stealthy boy-pirate hunch to his shoulders added the last touch of melodrama to the scene. Rollins, as a gay Lothario, was certainly a new idea. I could have screamed with joy. But while I debated the ethics of screaming for joy only, the May-girl herself, as though in reply to his crafty knock, opened her door and stared frankly down at him with a funny, flushed sort of astonishment. She was in her great boyish blanket wrapper, with her gauzy gold hair wafting like a bright breeze across her neck and shoulders, and the radiance of her, I think, would have startled any man, but it knocked the breath out of Rollins. "Pleasant," gasped Rollins quite abruptly. "It was a miracle." "Miracle?" puzzled the May-girl. "Wallpapers," babbled Rollins. "Suppose it had been true," he besought her. "Today, I mean, our betrothal." With total unexpectedness he began to flutter a handful of wallpaper samples under the May-girl's astonished nose. "I've got a little flat, in town," babbled Rollins. "Just one room and a bath. It's pretty dingy, but for a long time now I've been planning to have it all repapered, and if you choose the wallpaper for it, it would be pleasant to think of during the years," babbled Rollins. "What?" puzzled the May-girl. Then quite suddenly she reached out and took the papers from Rollins's hand and bent her lovely head over them in perfectly solemn contemplation. Why, the pretty grey one with the white gulls and the flash of blue," she decided almost at once, looked up for an instant, smiled straight into Rollins's fatuous eyes, and was gone again behind the impregnable fastness of her closed door, leaving Rollins gasping like a fool, his shoulders drooping, his limp hands clutching the sheet of white gauze with all the absurd manner of an amateur prima donna just on the verge of bursting into song. And all of a sudden, starting to laugh, I found myself crying instead. It was the expression in Rollins's eyes, I think. The one off-guard expression, perhaps, of Rollins's life. A scorching flame of self-revelation, as it were, that consumed even as it illuminated, leaving only grey ashes and perplexity. Not just the look it was, of a little man almost old who had never had a chance to play, but the look of a little man almost old who sensed suddenly for the first time that he never would have a chance to play, that fate, denying him the glint of wealth, the flash of romance, the scar even of tragedy, had stamped him merely with the indelible sign of a person who wasn't meant to be liked. Truly, I was very glad to steal back into my dark room for a moment, before trotting downstairs again to join all those others who were essentially intended for liking and loving, so eminently fitted, whether they refused or accepted it, for the full moral gamut of human experience. On my way down, it was only human, of course, to stop in the May-girl's room. Rollins or no Rollins, it was the May-girl's problem that seemed to me the only really maddening one of the moment. What in creation was life planning to proffer the May-girl? Dr. Braun? Dr. Braun? It wasn't just a question of Dr. Braun, but a question of the May-girl herself. She was still in her blanket wrapper when I entered the room, but had hopped into bed and sat bolt upright, rocking vaguely with her knees gathered to her chin in the circle of her slender arms. "What seems to be the matter?" I questioned. "That's what I don't know," she dimpled almost instantly, "but I seem to be worrying about something." "Worrying?" I puzzled. "Well, maybe it's about the palm dog," suggested the May-girl helpfully. "His mouth is so very, very tiny. Do you think he had enough supper?" "Oh, I'm sure he had enough supper," I hastened to reassure her. Very reflectively she narrowed her eyes to review the further field of her possible worries. "That cat that your husband said he sent away just before I came for fear I'd bring some contradictory animals. Are you quite sure he's got a good home?" she worried. "Oh, the best in the world," I said. "A maternity hospital." "Kittens?" brightened the May girl for a single instant only. "Oh, you really mean kittens? Then surely there's nothing to worry about in that direction." "Nothing but kittens," I conceded. "Then it must be Alan John," said the May girl. "His feet. Of course, I can't exactly help feeling pretty responsible for Alan John. Are you quite sure, I mean, that he hasn't been sitting around with wet feet all the evening? He isn't exactly the croupy type, of course, but—" With a sudden irrelevant gesture she unclasped her knees and shot her feet straight out in front of her. "Whatever in the world," she cried, "am I going to do with Alan John when it comes time to go home? Now, goldfish," she reflected, "in a real emergency, can always be tucked away in the bathtub. And once when I brought home a Japanese baby—" She giggled in spite of herself. "They made me keep it in my own room, but I've got a worry of my own," I interrupted. "It's about your fainting. It scared me dreadfully. I've just been telephoning to Dr. Braun about it." Across the May girl's supple body a curious tightness settled suddenly. "You told Dr. Braun that I fainted?" she said. You oughtn't to have done that." It was only too evident that she was displeased. "But we were worried," I repeated. "We had to tell him. We didn't like to take the responsibility." With her childish hands spread flatly as a brace on either side of her, she seemed to retreat for a moment into the gold veil of her hair. Then very resolutely her face came peering out again. "And just what did Dr. Braun tell you?" asked the May girl. "Why, something very romantic," I admitted. "The somewhat astonishing news, in fact, that you were engaged to him." "Oh, but you know I'm not," protested the May girl with unmistakable emphasis. "No. "And that he was hoping to be married next September. On the 15th, to be perfectly exact," I confided. "Well, very likely I shall marry him," admitted the May girl somewhat bafflingly. "But I'm not engaged to him now. Oh, I'm much too young to be engaged to him now. Why, even my grandmother thinks I'm much too young to be engaged to him now. Why, he's most 50 years old," she affirmed with widely dilating eyes. "And I've scarcely been off my grandmother's place, you know, until this last winter. But if I'm grown up enough by September, they say. You see, I'll be 18 and a half by September," she explained painstakingly. "So that's why I wanted to get engaged as much as I could this week," she interrupted herself with quite merciless irrelevance. "If I've got to be married in September, without ever having been engaged or courted at all, I just thought I'd better go to work and pick up what experience I could, on my own hook." Dr. Braun will, of course, make you a very distinguished husband," I stammered. "But are you sure you love him?" "I love everybody," dimpled the May girl. "Yes, dogs, of course," I conceded, "and rabbits, and horses, and kittens," supplemented the May girl. "Your mother is not living?" I asked rather abruptly. "My father is dead," said the May girl, "but my mother is in Egypt." Her lovely face was suddenly all excitement. "My mother ran away." "Oh, an elopement, you mean?" I laughed. "Ran away with your father? Youngsters used to do romantic things like that." "Ran away from my father," said the May girl. "And from me. It was when I was 4 years old. None of us have ever seen her since. It was with one of Dr. Braun's friends that she ran away. That's one reason, I think, why Dr. Braun has always felt sort of responsible for me." "Oh, dear. Oh, dear. This is very sad," I winced. "No," said the May girl perfectly simply. "Maybe it was bad, but I'm almost sure it's never been sad. Dr. Braun hears from her sometimes. Mother's always been very happy, I think. But everybody somehow seems to be in an awful hurry to get me settled." "Why?" I asked quite starkly, and could have bitten my tongue out for my impertinence. "Why, because I'm so tall, I suppose," said the May girl, "and not so very specially bright. "Oh, not nearly as bright as I am tall," she hastened to assure me, with her pretty nose all crinkled up for the sheer emphasis of her regret. "Life's rather hard, you know, on tall women," she confided sagely. "Always trying to take a tuck in them somewhere. Mother was tall," she observed, "and father, they say, was always and forever trying to make her look smaller, especially in public, pulling her opinions out from under her, belittling all her great lovely fancies and ideas. Not that he really meant to be hateful, I suppose, but he just couldn't help it. It was just the natural male instinct, I guess, of wanting to be the everythinger himself." "What do you know of the natural male instinct?" I laughed out in spite of myself. "Oh, lots," smiled the May girl. "I have an uncle, and my grandmother always keeps 2 hired men. And for almost 6 months now I've been at the art school, and there are 27 boys at the art school. Why, there's Jerry, and Paul, and Richard, and... Yes, but your father and mother," I pondered. "Just how—" "Oh, it was when they were walking downtown one day, past a great big mirror," explained the May girl brightly. "And mother saw that she was getting round-shouldered, trying to keep down to father's level. It was then that she ran away. It was then that she began to run away, to run away in her mind. I heard grandmother and Dr. Braun talking about it only last summer. But I," she affirmed with some pride, "oh, I've known about being tall ever since I first had starch enough in my knees to stand up. While I stayed in my crib, I don't suppose I noticed it specially, but just as soon as I was big enough to go to school. Why, even at the very first," she glowed, "when every other child in the room had failed without the slightest reproach, some perfectly idiotic visitor would always pipe up and say, 'Now ask that tall child there, the one with the yellow hair,' and everyone would be as vexed as possible because I failed too. It isn't my head, you know, that's tall," protested the May girl with some feeling. "It's just my neck and legs." "You certainly are entrancingly graceful," I smiled. How anybody as inexpressively lovely as the May girl could be so oblivious of the fact was astonishing. But neither smile nor compliment seemed to allay to the slightest degree the turmoil that was surging in the youngster's mind. "Why, even at the art school," she protested, "it's just as bad. Especially with the boys. Being so tall, and with yellow hair besides, you just can't possibly be as important as you are conspicuous. And yet every individual boy seems obliged to find out for himself just exactly how important you are. But no matter what he finds," she shrugged with a gesture of ultimate despair, "it always ends up by everybody getting mad." "Mad?" I questioned. "Yes, very mad," said the May girl. "Either he's mad because he finds you're not nearly as nice as you are conspicuous, or else, liking you most to death, he simply can't stand it that anyone as nice as he thinks you are is able to outplay him at tennis. Or that's why I like animals best. And hurt things." She interrupted herself with characteristic impetuosity. "Animals and hurt things don't care how rangy your arms are as long as they're loving. Why, if you're as tall as a tree," she argued, "little deserted birds in nests would simply be glad that you could reach them that much sooner. But men? Why, even your nice Mr. Keats," she cried, "even your nice Mr. Keats, with his fussy old archaeology, couldn't even play at being engaged without talking down at me, tall as he is, too. And funny little old Mr. Rollins," she flushed. Little old Mr. Rollins. Mr. Rollins really liked me, I think, but he'd torture me if he thought it would make him feel any burlier." "And Claude Kenilworth?" I questioned. The shiver across the May girl's shoulders looked suddenly more like a thrill than a distaste. "Oh, Claude Kenilworth," she acknowledged quite ingenuously. "He's begun already to try to put me in my place. Altogether too independent is what he thinks I am, but what he really means is altogether too tall." Once again the little shiver flashed across her shoulders. "He's so awfully temperamental," she quickened. "Goodness knows what fireworks he'll introduce tomorrow. I can hardly wait." Is Dr. Braun tall?" I asked a bit abruptly. No, admitted the May girl. He's quite short. But his years are so tall, she cried out triumphantly. He's so tall in his attainments. I've thought it all out. Oh, very, very carefully, she attested. And if I've got to be married, in order to have someone to look out for me, I'm almost perfectly positive that Dr. Brown will be quite too amused at having so young a wife to bully me very much about anything that goes with the youngness. Oh, I said. Yes, exactly, mused the May girl. With a heart and an apprehension just about as grey and as heavy as lead, I rose and started for the door. But, May girl, I besought her in a single, almost hysterical desire to rouse her from her innocence and her ignorance, among all this great array of men and boys that you know, the uncle, yes, even the hired men, I laughed, and all those blue-smocked boys at the art school, whom do you really like the best? So far her eyes journeyed off into the distance and back again. I thought that she had not heard me. Then quite abruptly she answered me, and her voice was all boy chorister again. The best? Why, Alan John, she said. Taken all in all, there were several things said and done that evening that would have kept any normal hostess awake, I think. The third morning dawned even rainier than the second, infinitely rainier than the first. It gave everybody's coming downstairs expression a curiously comical twist, as though Dame Nature herself had been caught off guard somehow in a moment of déshabille that, though inexpressibly funny, couldn't exactly be referred to, not among mere casual acquaintances, not so early in the morning anyway. Yet even though everybody rushed at once to the fireplace instead of to the breakfast table, nobody held us responsible for the weather. Everyone, in fact, seemed to make rather an extra effort to assure us that he or she, as the case might be, most distinctly did not hold us responsible. Paul Brunswick, indeed, grew almost eloquent, telling us about an accident to the weather which he himself had witnessed in a climate as supposedly well regulated as the climate of south-eastern somewhere was supposed to be. Anne Walter raked her cheerier memories for the story of a 4 days' rainstorm which she had experienced once in a very trying visit to her great-aunt somebody or other on some peculiarly storm-bound section of the Welsh coast. George Keats's chivalrous anxiety to set us at our ease was truly heroic. He even improvised a parody about it. "Rain," observed George Keats, "makes strange umbrella mates." A leak had developed during the night, it seemed, in the ceiling directly over his bed, and George, the finicky, the fastidious, the silk-pyjamered, had been obliged to crawl out and seek shelter with Rollins and his flannel nightcap in the next room, and Rollins, it appeared, had not proved a particularly genial host. "By the way, where is Mr. Rollins this morning?" questioned the bride from her frowning survey of the storm-swept beach. "Mr. Rollins," confided my husband, "has a slight headache this morning." "Why, that's too bad," sympathized Anne Walter. "No, it isn't a bad one at all," contradicted my husband. "Just the very mildest one possible, under the circumstances. It was really very late when he got in again last night, and very wet." From under his casually lowered eyes a single glance of greeting shot out at me. "Now there you are again," cried George Keats. "Flirting! You married people! Something that anyone else would turn out as mere information. The iceman has just left 2 chunks of ice, or Mr. Rollins has a headache. You go and load up with some mysterious and unfathomable significance. Glances pass. Your wife flushes." "Mysterious?" shrugged my husband. "Unfathomable? Why, it's as clear as crystal. The madam says, 'Let there be a headache,' and there is a headache." As Alan John joined the group at the fireplace, everybody began talking weather again. From the chuckle of the birch logs to the splash on the window-pane, the little groups shifted and changed. Everybody seemed to be waiting for something. On the neglected breakfast table, even the gay, upstanding hemispheres of grapefruit rolled over on their beds of ice to take another nap. In a great flutter of white and laughter, the May girl herself came prancing over the threshold. It wasn't just the fact of being in white that made her look so astonishingly festal. She was almost always in white. Not yet the fact of laughter. Taken all in all, I think she was the most radiantly laughing youngster that I had ever known. But most astonishingly festal she certainly looked, nevertheless. Maybe it was the specially new and chic little twist which she had given her hair. Maybe it was the absurdly coquettish dab of black court plaster which she had affixed to one dimply cheek. "Oh, if I'm going to be engaged today to a real artist," she laughed, "I've certainly got to take some extra pains with my personal appearance. Why, I've hardly slept all night," she confided ingenuously. "I was so excited." "Yes, won't it be interesting," whispered the bride to George Keats, "to see what Mr. Kenilworth will really do? He's so awfully temperamental, and so inexcusably beautiful. Whatever he does is pretty sure to be interesting. Now upstairs all day yesterday, wouldn't it—" "Yes, wouldn't it be interesting," glowed Anne Walter quite unexpectedly, "if he'd made her something really wonderful. Something that would last, I mean, after the game was over. Even just a toy, something that would outlast time itself. Something that even when she was old she could point to and say, 'Claude Kenilworth made that for me when we were young.'" "Why, Anne Walter," I stammered, "do you feel that way about him? Does he make you feel that way too?" "I think he would make anyone feel that way too," intercepted Alan John quite amazingly. In 3 days, surely it was the only voluntary statement he had made, and everybody turned suddenly to stare at him. But it was only too evident from the persistent haggardness of his expression that he had no slightest intention in the world of pursuing his unexpected volubility. "And it isn't just his good looks either," resumed the bride as soon as she had recovered from her own astonishment at the interpolation. "Oh, something very different," mused Anne Walter. "The queer little sense he gives you of Weir's humming. Whether you like him or not, that queer little sense of Weir's humming that all really creative people give you, as though they were being rather specially recharged all the time from the main battery." "The main battery?" puzzled the bridegroom. "Being—" "Why, God, of course," said the bride with a vague sort of surprise. "When women talk mechanics and religion in the same breath," laughed the bridegroom, "it's certainly—" "I was talking neither mechanics nor religion," affirmed the bride, with the faintest possible tinge of asperity. "Oh, of course, anyone can see," admitted the bridegroom, "that Kenilworth is a clever chap." "Clever as the deuce," acquiesced George Keats. With an impatient tap of her foot, the May girl turned suddenly back from the window. "Yes, but where is he?" she laughed. "That's what I say," cried my husband. "We've waited quite long enough for him." "Dallying upstairs probably to put a dab of black court plaster on his cheek," observed George Keats dryly. With one accord everybody but the May girl rushed impulsively to the breakfast table. "Seems as though somebody ought to wait," dimpled the May girl. "Oh, nonsense," asserted everybody. A little bit reluctantly she came at last to her place. Her face was faintly troubled. On an engagement morning," she persisted, "it certainly seems as though somebody ought to wait." In the hallway just outside a light step sounded suddenly. It was really astonishing with what an air of real excitement and expectancy everybody glanced up. But the step in the hall proved only the step of a maid. "The young gentleman upstairs sent a message," said the maid. "Most particular he was that I give it exact. It being so rainy again, he says, and there not being anything specially interesting on the docket as far as he knows, he'll stay in bed. Thank you." For an instant it seemed as though everybody at the table except Alan John jerked back from his plate with a knife, fork, or spoon brandished halfway in mid-air. There was no jerk left in Alan John, I imagine. It was Alan John's colour that changed, a dull flush of red where once just grey shadows had lain. "So he'll stay in bed, thank you," repeated the maid sing-songishly. "What?" gasped my husband. "What?" stammered the May girl. "Well, of all the nerve!" muttered Paul Brenswick. Why, how extraordinary!" murmured Anne Walter. "There's your artistic temperament for you, all right," laughed the bride a bit hectically. "Peeved is he because he thought Miss Davies—" "Don't you think you're just a little bit behind the times in your interpretation of the phrase artistic temperament?" interrupted George Keats abruptly. Except in special neurasthenic cases, it is no longer the fashion, I believe, to lay bad manners to the artistic temperament itself, but rather to the humble environment from which most artistic temperaments are supposed to have sprung." "Eh? What's that?" laughed the bride. Very deliberately, George Keats lit a fresh cigarette. "No one person, you know, can have everything," he observed with the thinnest of all his thin-lipped smiles. 3 generations of ploughing, isn't it, to raise one artist? Oh, Mr. Kenilworth's social eccentricities, I assure you, are due infinitely more to the soil than to the soul." "Oh, can your statistics," implored my husband a bit sharply, "and pass Miss Davies the sugar." "And some coffee," proffered Paul Brenswick. "And this heavenly cereal," urged the bride. "Oh, now I remember," winced the May girl suddenly. "He said she'll wait all right. But, of course, it does seem just a little wee bit funny. Even if you don't care a rap," she struggled heroically through a glint of tears. "Even if you don't care a rap, sometimes it's just a little bit hard to say a word like funny." "Damned hard," agreed my husband and Paul Brenswick and George Keats, all in a single breath. The subsequent conversation, fortunately, was not limited altogether to expletives. Never, I'm sure, have I entertained a more vivacious, not to say hilarious, company at breakfast. Nobody seemed contented just to keep dimples in the May girl's face. Everybody insisted upon giggles. The men, indeed, treated themselves to what is usually described as wild guffaws. Personally, I think it was a mistake. It brought Rollins downstairs, just as everybody was leaving the table in what had up to that moment been considered perfectly re-established and invulnerable glee. Everybody, of course, except poor Alan John. No one, naturally, would expect any kind of glee from Alan John. In the soft pussy-footed flop of his felt slippers none of us heard Rollins coming. But I saw him. And such a Rollins! Stripped of the single significant facial expression of his life, which I had surprised so unexpectedly in his eyes the night before, Rollins would certainly never be anything but just Rollins. Heavily swathed in his old plaid ulster, with a wet towel bound round his brow, he loomed cautiously on the scene, bearing an empty coffee-cup, and from the faintly shadowing delicacy of the parted portieres affirmed with one breath how astonished he was to find us still at breakfast, while with the next he confided equally fatuously, "I thought I heard merry voices." It was on Claude Kenilworth's absence, of course, that his maddening little mind fixed itself instantly with unalterable concentration. "What ho! The engagement?" he demanded abruptly. "There isn't any engagement," said my husband, with a somewhat vicious stab at the fire. From his snug, speculative scrutiny of the storm outside, George Keats swung round with what quite evidently was intended to be a warning frown. "Mr. Kenilworth has defaulted," he murmured. "Defaulted?" grinned Rollins. Then, with perfectly unprecedented perspicacity, his roving glance snatched up suddenly the unmistakable tremor of the May girl's chin. "Oh, what nonsense!" he said. "There are plenty of other eligible men in the party." "Oh, but you see there are not," laughed Paul Brenswick. "Mr. Deville and I are married, and our wives won't let us." "Oh, nonsense!" grinned Rollins. Once again his roving glance swept the company. Everybody saw what was coming, turned hot, turned cold, shut his eyes, opened them again, but was powerless to avert. "Why, what's the matter with trying Alan John?" grinned Rollins. The thing was inexcusable, brutal, blundering, absolutely doltish beyond even Rollins's established methods of doltishness. But at last, when everybody turned inadvertently to scan poor Alan John's face, there was no Alan John to be scanned. Somewhere through a door or a window, somehow, between one blink of the eye and another, Alan John had slipped from the room. Why, Mr. Rollins!" gasped everybody all at once. "Whatever in the world were you thinking of?" Maybe he didn't hear it, after all," rallied the bride with the first real ray of hope. "Maybe he just saw it coming," suggested the bridegroom. and dodged it in the nick of time," said George Keats. "To save not only himself, but ourselves," frowned my husband, from an almost irretrievable awkwardness. "Why, just the minute before it happened," deprecated Anne Woolter. "I was thinking suddenly how much better he looked, how his color had improved. Why, his cheeks looked almost red." "Yes, the top of his cheeks," said the May girl, "were really quite red." Her own cheeks at the moment were distinctly pale. "Where do you suppose he's gone to?" she questioned. "Don't you think that perhaps somebody ought to go and find him?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, leave him alone!" cried Paul Brenswick. "Leave him alone," acquiesced all the other men. In the moment's nervous reaction and let-down that ensued, it was really a relief to hear George Keats cry out, with such poignant amazement, from his stand at the window. "Why, what in the world is that red roof out in the rocks?" he cried. In the same impulse both my husband and myself ran quickly to his side. "Oh, that's all right," laughed my husband. "I thought maybe it had blown off or something. Why, that's just the bungalow on the rocks," he explained. "My husband's study and workroom," I exemplified. "Forbidden ground" is its real name. Nobody is ever allowed to go there without an invitation from himself. "Why, but it wasn't there yesterday," asserted George Keats. "Oh, yes, it was," laughed my husband. "It was not," said George Keats. The sheer unexpected primitiveness of the contradiction delighted us so that neither of us took the slightest offense. "Oh, I beg your pardon, of course." George Keats recovered himself almost in an instant. "That right here before our eyes, that same vivid scarlet roof was looming there yesterday against the grey rocks and sea, and none of us saw it?" "Saw what?" called Paul Brenswick. "Where?" and came striding to the window. "Gad!" said Paul Brenswick. "Victoria, come here, quick!" he called. With frank curiosity the bride joined the group. "Why, of all things!" she laughed. "Why, it never in the world was there yesterday!" A trifle self-consciously Anne Woolter joined the group. "Bungalow?" she questioned. "A bungalow out on the rocks?" Her face did certainly look just a little bit queer. Anyone who wanted to was perfectly free, of course, to interpret the look as one of incredulity. "No, of course not. Miss Woolter agrees with me perfectly," triumphed George Keats. "It was not there yesterday." "Oh, but it must have been," dimpled the May girl. "If Mr. and Mrs. Deville say so. It's their bungalow." "It was not there yesterday," puzzled George Keats. More than having his honor at stake, he spoke suddenly as though he thought it was his reason that was being threatened. With her cheeks quite rosy again, the May girl began to clap her hands. Her eyes were sparkling with excitement. "Oh, I don't care whether it was there yesterday or not," she triumphed. "It's there today. Let's go and explore it. And if it's magic, so much the better. Oh, look!" she cried as a great roar and surge of billows broke on the rocks all around the little red roof and churned the whole skyline into a chaos of foam. "Oh, come, come!" she besought everybody. "Oh, but my dear," I explained, "how would you get there? No rowboat could live in that sea, and by way of the rocky ledge there's no possible path except at the lowest tide. And besides," I reminded her, "it's named Forbidden Ground, you know. Nobody is supposed to go there without—" With all the impulsiveness of an irresponsible baby, the May girl dashed across the room and threw her arms around my neck. "Why, you old dear," she laughed, "don't you know that's just the reason why I want to explore it? I want to know why it's forbidden ground. Oh, surely, surely," she coaxed, "even if it is a workroom, there couldn't be any real sin in just prying a little." "No, of course, no real sin," I laughed back at her earnestness. "Just an indiscretion." Quite abruptly the May girl relaxed her hug and narrowed her lovely eyes dreamily to some personal introspection. "I've never yet committed a real indiscretion," she confided with apparent regret. "Oh, well, pray don't begin," laughed George Keats in spite of himself, "by trying to explore something that isn't there." "And don't you and Keats," flared Paul Brenswick quite unexpectedly, "by denying the existence of something that is there." "Well, if it is there today," argued George Keats, "it certainly wasn't there yesterday." "Well, if it wasn't there yesterday, it is at least there today," argued Paul Brenswick. "Rollins! Hi there, Rollins!" they both called as though in a single breath. from his humble seat on the top stair, to which he had wisely retreated at his first inkling of having so grossly outraged public opinion, Rollins' reply came wafting somewhat hopefully back. "Hi," rallied Rollins. "That red roof on the rocks," shouted Paul Brenswick. "Was it there yesterday?" demanded George Keats. "Wait," cackled Rollins. "Wait till I go look." A felt footstep thudded. A window opened. The felt footstep thudded again. "No," called Rollins. "Now that I come to think of it, I don't remember having noticed a red roof there yesterday." "Now!" laughed George Keats. "But oh, I say," gasped Rollins, in what seemed to be very sudden and altogether indisputable confusion. Why, it must have been there, because that's the shack where we've catalogued the shells every year, for the last 7 years." "Now!" laughed Paul Brenswick. Without another word, everybody made a bolt for the hat rack and the big oak settle, snatched up his or her oilskin clothes, anybody's oilskin clothes, and dashed off through the rain to the edge of the cliff to investigate the phenomenon at closer range. Truly, the thing was almost too easy to be really righteous. Just a huge rock-colored tarpaulin stripped at will from a red-tiled roof, and behold, mystery looms on an otherwise drab-colored day. And a mystery at a house-party? Well, whoever may stand proven as the mother of invention, curiosity, you know just as well as I do, is the father of a great many very sprightly little adventures. Within 10 minutes from the proscenium box at our big bay window, my husband and I could easily discern the absurd little plot and counterplots that were already being hatched. It was the bride and George Keats who seemed to be thinking, pointing, gesticulating, in the only perfect harmony. Even at this distance, and swathed as they were in hastily adjusted oilskins, a curiously academic sort of dignity stamped their every movement. Nothing but sheer intellectual determination to prove that their minds were normal would ever tempt either of them to violate a host's no trespass sign. Nothing academic about Paul Brenswick's figure. With one yellow elbow crooked to shield the rain from his eyes, he stood estimating so many probable feet of this, so many probable feet of that. He was an engineer. Perspectives were his playthings, and if there was any new trick about perspectives that he didn't know, he was going to solve it now, no matter what it cost either him or anybody else. More like a young colt than anything else, like a young colt running for its pasture bars, the May girl dashed vainly up and down the edge of the cliff. Nothing academic, nothing of the engineer, about any young colt. If the May girl reached the bungalow on the rocks, it would be just because she wanted to. Anne Walter's reaction was the only one that really puzzled me. Drawn back a little from the others, sheltered transiently from the wind by a great jagged spur of grey rock, but with her sombre face turned almost eagerly to the rain, she stood there watching with a perfectly inexplainable interest the long white blossomy curve of foam and spray which marked the darkly submerged ledge of rock that connected the red-tiled bungalow with the beach just below her. Anne Walter certainly was no prankish child. Neither was it to be supposed that any particular problem of perspective had flecked her mind with the slightest uneasiness. Anne Walter knew that that bungalow was there, had spent at least 9 hours in it on the previous day, lunched in it, supped in it, proved its inherent prosiness. Yet even I was puzzled as she crept out from the shelter of her big boulder to the very edge of the cliff and leaned away out, still staring, always at that wave-tormented ledge. From the hyacinth-scented shadows just behind me I heard a sudden little laugh. "I'll wager you a new mink muff," said my husband quite abruptly, "that Anne Walter gets there first." End of Chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Rainy Week by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jenny McCann. In this annual Rainy Week drama of ours, one of the very best parts I double in is with the chambermaid, making beds. Once having warned my guests of this occasional domestic necessity, I ought, I suppose, to feel absolutely relieved of any embarrassing sense of intrusion incidental to the task. But there is always somehow such an unwarrantable sense of spiritual rather than material intimacy connected with the sight of a just deserted guest room, Particularly so, I think, in a seashore guest room. A beach makes such big babies of us all. Country house hostesses have never mentioned it as far as I can remember. Mountains evidently do not recover for us that particular kind of lost rapture, nor even green pine woods revive the innocent lusts of the little. But in a seashore guest room every fresh morning of the world, as long as time lasts, you will find on bureau top, desk, or table, mixed up with chiffons and rouges, crowding the tennis rackets or baseballs, blurring the open sophisticate page of the latest French novel, that dear, absurd, ever-increasing little hoard of childish treasures. The round shining pebbles, the fluted clamshell, the wops of dried seaweed, a feather perhaps from a gull's wing. Things common as time itself, repetitive as sand, yet irresistibly covetable. How do you explain it? Who in the world, for instance, would expect to find a cunningly contrived toy boat on Rollins's bureau with 2 starfish listed as the only passengers? Or Paul Brunswick's candle thrust into a copperas-tinted knot of waterlogged cedar? In the snug confines of a small cigar-box on a lovely dank bed of maroon and grey seaweed, Victoria Brunswick had nested her treasure trove. Certainly the quaint garnet necklace could hardly have found a more romantic and shipwrecky sort of a setting. Even Alan John had started a little procession of sand dollars across his mantelpiece, but there was no silver whistle figuring as the band, I noticed. What would Victoria Brunswick have said, I wondered, what would Alan John have thought, if they had even so much as dreamed that these precious shipwreck treasures of theirs had been purchased brand new in Boston town within a week and planted most carefully by my husband, with all those other pseudo-mysteries in the old trunk in the sand. But goodness me, one's got to start something on the first day of even the most ordinary house party. With so much to watch outside the window, figures still moving eagerly up and down the edge of the cliff, and so much to think about inside, all the little personal whims and fancies betrayed by the various hoards, the bed-making industry, I'm afraid, was somewhat slighted on this particular morning. Was my husband still standing at that downstairs window, I wondered, speculating about that bungalow on the rocks, even as I stood at the window just above him, speculating on the same subject? Why did he think that Ann Walter would be the one to get there first? What had Ann Walter left there the day before that made her specially anxious to get there first? Truly this rainy week experiment developed some rather unique puzzles. Maybe if I tried, I thought, I could add a little puzzle of my own invention. Just for sheer restiveness I turned and made another round of the guest rooms. Now that I remembered it, there was a bit more sand oozing from the bride's necklace box to the mahogany bureau top than was really necessary. The rest of the morning passed without special interest, but the luncheon hour developed a most extraordinary interest in the principles of physical geography, which, beginning with all sorts of valuable observations concerning the weight of the atmosphere, or the conformation of mountains, or the law of tides, ended invariably with the one direct question, at just what hour this evening, for instance, will the tide be low again? My husband was almost beside himself with concealed delight. "Oh, but you don't think for a moment, do you?" I implored him in a single whisper of privacy snatched behind the refilling of the coffee urn. "You don't think for a moment that anybody would be rash enough to try and make the trip in the big dory?" "Well, hardly," laughed my husband, "if you'd seen where I've hidden the oars." The oars apparently were not the only things hidden at the moment from mortal ken. Claude, Kenilworth, and Ego still persisted quite brutally in withholding their charms from us. Rollins had retreated to the sacristy of his own room to complete his convalescence, and even Alan John seemed to have wandered for the time being beyond the call of either voice or luncheon bell. Alan John's deflection worried the May girl a little, I think, but not unduly. It didn't worry the men at all. "When a chap wants to be alone, he wants to be alone," explained Paul Brunswick with unassailable conciseness. "It's a darned good sign," agreed my husband, "that he's ready to be alone. It's the first time, isn't it?" "Yes, that's all right, of course," conceded the May girl amiably, "if you're quite sure that he was dressed right for it." "Maybe a hike on the beach at just this moment, whether he's dressed right for it or not," asserted George Keats, "is just the one thing the poor devil needs to sweep the last cobweb out of his brain." "I agree with you perfectly," said Victoria Brunswick. It was really astonishing in a single morning how many things George Keats and the bride had discovered that they agreed on perfectly. It teased the bridegroom a little, I think, but anyone could have seen that it actually puzzled the bride. And women, when they are puzzled, I've noticed, are pretty apt to insist upon tracing the puzzle to its source. So that when George Keats suggested a further exploration of the dunes as the most plausible diversion for the afternoon, it wouldn't have surprised me at all if Victoria Brunswick had not only acquiesced in the suggestion for herself and her bridegroom, but exacted its immediate fulfillment. She did not, however. Quite peremptorily, in fact, she announced instead her own and her bridegroom's unalterable intent to remain at home in the big warm library by the applewood fire. It was the May girl who insisted on forging forth alone with George Keats into the storm. "Why, I shall perish," dimpled the May girl, "if I don't get some more exercise today. Weather like this, why, it's so glorious," she thrilled. "So maddeningly glorious. I wish I was a seagull, so I could breast right off into the foam and blast of it. I wish But what page is long enough to record the wishes of 18? My husband evidently had no wish in the world except to pursue the cataloguing of shells in Rollins's crafty company. Anne Walter confessed quite frankly that her whole human interest in the afternoon centered solely on the matter of sleep. Hyacinths, of course, are my own unfailing diversion. Tracking me just a little bit self-consciously to my hyacinth lair, the bride seemed rather inclined to dally a moment, I noticed, before returning to her bridegroom and the library fire. Her eyes were very interesting. What brides are not? Particularly that bride whose intellect parallels even her emotions. "Maybe," she assessed quite abruptly, "maybe it was a trifle funny of me not to tramp this afternoon. But the bridge-building work begins again next week, you know. It's pretty strenuous, everybody says. Men come home very tired from it, not specially sociable. So I just made up my mind," she said, in a voice that though playfully lowered was yet rather curiously intense. "So I just made up my mind that I would stay at home this afternoon and get acquainted with my husband." Half proud, half shamed, her puzzled eyes lifted to mine. "Because it's dawned on me very suddenly," she laughed, "that I don't know my husband's opinion on one solitary subject in the world. Just me." With a rather amusing little flush, she stooped down and smothered her face in a pot of blue hyacinths. "Oh, hyacinths," she murmured. "And May rain, the smell of them! Will I ever forget the fragrance of this week while time lasts?" But the eyes that lifted to mine again were still puzzled. "Now, that Mr. Keats," she faltered, "why, in just an hour or two this morning, why, in just the little time that luncheon takes, I know his religion and his mother's first name. I know his philosophies, and just why he adores Buskin and disagrees with Bernard Shaw. I know where he usually stays when he's in Amsterdam, and just what hotel we both like best in Paris. Why, I even know where he buys his boots, and why. And I buy mine at the same place and for just exactly the same reason. But my husband—" Quite in spite of herself, a little laugh slipped from her lips. "Why, I don't even know how my husband votes," she gasped. In some magic, excitative flash of memory her breath began to quicken. It was at college, you know, that we met, Paul and I," she explained, "at a dance the night before my graduation." Once again her face flamed like a rose. "Why, we were engaged, you know, within a week. And then Paul went to China. Oh, of course we wrote," she said, "and almost every day, too, but—" "But lovers, of course, don't write a great deal about buying boots," I acquiesced, "nor even so specially much about Buskin, nor even their mothers." In the square of the library doorway a man's figure loomed a bit suddenly. "Vic, aren't you ever coming?" fretted her impatient bridegroom. Like a homing-bird she turned and sped to her mate. Yet an hour later, when I passed the library door, I saw Paul Brunswick lying fast asleep in the depth of his big leather chair. Fire wasted, books neglected, chance itself forgotten or ignored. But the bride was nowhere to be seen. I was quite right, though, when I thought that I should find her in her room. Just as I expected, too, she was standing by the window, staring somewhat blankly out at the dunes. But the eyes that she lifted to me this time were not merely puzzled, they were suffering. If Paul Brunswick could have seen his beloved at this moment, and even so much as hoped that there was a God, he would have gone down on his knees then and there, and prayed that for love's sake the very real shock which he had just given her would end in laughter rather than tears. Yet her speech when it came at last was perfectly casual. He wouldn't talk, she said. Couldn't, you mean? I contradicted her quite sharply. Husbands can't, you know. Marriage seems to do something queer to their vocal cords. Your husband talks, smiled the bride very faintly. Oh, beautifully, I admitted, but not to me. It doesn't seem to be quite compatible with established romance somehow, this talking business between husbands and wives. Romance? Rallied the bride. Would you call Mr. Delville exactly romantic? Oh, very, I boasted, but not conversationally. But I wanted to talk, said the bride, very slowly. Why, of course you did, you dear darling, I cried out impulsively. Most brides do. You wanted to discuss and decide in about 30 minutes every imaginable issue that is yet to develop in all the long glad years you hope to have together. The friends you are going to build. Why, you haven't even glimpsed a child's picture in a magazine this the first week of your marriage, without staying awake half the night to wonder what your children's names will be. How do you know? Asked the bride, a bit incisively. Because once I was a bride myself, I said. But this Paul of yours, I insisted, this Paul of yours, you see, hasn't finished wondering yet about just you. For heaven's sake, called my own husband through the half-open doorway, what's all this powwow about? About husbands, I answered, quite frankly. An argument, in fact, as to whether, taken all in all, a husband is ever very specially amusing to talk to. Amusing to talk to? Hooted my husband. Never! The most that any poor husband can hope for is to prove amusing to talk about. Who said Paul? Called that young person himself from the further shadows of the hallway. No one has, I laughed, for as much as 2 minutes. A trifle flushed from his nap and most becomingly dishevelled as to hair, the bridegroom stepped into the light. I heard his bride give a little sharp catch of her breath. I think I must have been asleep, said the bridegroom. Twice the bride swallowed very hard before she spoke. I think you must have, you rascal, she said. It was a real victory. Really, my husband and I would have been banged in the door if we hadn't jumped out as fast as we did. George Keats and the May girl came in from their walk just before supper. Judging from their personal appearances, it had at least been a long walk, if not a serene one. George Keats indeed seemed quite unnecessarily intent in the vestibule on taking the May girl to task for what he evidently considered her somewhat careless method of storing away her afternoon's accumulation of pebble and shell. Every accent of his voice, every carefully enunciated syllable, reminded me only too absurdly of what the May girl had confided to me about boys always trying to make her feel small. He was urging her now, I inferred, to stop and sort out her specimens according to some careful cotton-batting plan which he suggested. Whatever is worth doing at all, you know, Miss Davies, he said, is worth doing well. The May girl's voice sounded very tired, not irritable, but very tired. Oh, if there's anything in the world that I hate, I heard her cry out, it's that proverb. What people really mean by it, she protested, is, whatever's worth doing at all is worth doing swell. And it isn't either. I tell you I like simple things best. All I ever wanted to do with my shells tonight is just to chuck 'em behind the door. Truly, if Claude Kenilworth hadn't turned up for supper, all in white flannels and looking like a young god, I don't know just what I should have done. Everybody seemed either so tired or so distrait. The tide would be low at 10 o'clock. It was 8 o'clock when we sat down to supper. Ann Walter, I'm sure, never took her eyes from the clock. But to be perfectly frank, everybody else at the table, except the May girl, seemed to be diverting such attention as he or she retained to the personal appearance of Claude Kenilworth. Truly, it wasn't right that anyone who had been so hateful all day long should be able to look so perfectly glorious in the evening. "Where did you get the suit?" said Rollins. "Is it your own?" "And the permanent wave?" questioned the bride. "I think you and the ocean must patronize the same hairdresser." "Dark men always do look so fine in white flannels," whispered Ann Walter to my husband. "Personally," beamed Paul Brenswick, "you look to me like a person who had imported his own Turkish bath." "Turkish?" scoffed George Keats. "Nobody works up a shine like that by being washed only in one language. Russian, too, it must be. Flemish." "Flemish are rabbits," observed the May girl gravely. But even with this observation she did not lift her eyes from her plate. Whether she was consciously and determinedly ignoring Claude Kenilworth's only too palpable efforts to impress her with the fact that now at last he was ready to forgive her and subjugate her, or whether she really hadn't noticed him, I couldn't quite make out. And then quite suddenly, at the end of her first course, she put down her knife and fork and folded her hands in her lap. "Where is Alan John?" she demanded. "Why, yes, that's so. Where is Alan John?" questioned everybody all at once. "Some walk he's taking," reflected Paul Brenswick. "Not too long, I hope," worried my husband very faintly. "Hang it all, I do like that lad," acknowledged George Keats. "Who wouldn't?" said young Kenilworth. "Yes, but why?" demanded Keats. "It's his eyes," said the bride. "Eyes nothing," scoffed young Kenilworth. "It's the way he came out of his fuss without fussing. To make a fool of yourself, but never a fuss, that's my idea of a fellow being a good sport." "It was his tragedy that I was thinking of," said George Keats very quietly. "Yes, where in the world," questioned my husband with quite unwonted emotion, "would you have found another chap in the same harrowing circumstances, even among your own friends, I mean, a chum, a pal, who could have dropped in here the way he has, without putting a damper on everything? Not intentionally, of course, but just in the inevitable human nature of things. But I don't get the slightest sense, somehow, of Alan John being a damper." "Damper?" said the bride. "Why, he's like a sick man basking in the sun. Hasn't a word to say himself, not a single prance in his own feet, but I'd as soon think of shutting out the sun from a sick man as shutting out a laugh from Alan John. Why, Alan John needs us," attested the bride, "and Alan John knows that he needs us." With a sideways glance at the vacant chair, George Keats's thin lips parted into a really sweet smile. "Where in creation is the boy?" he insisted. "Frankly, I think we rather need him." "All of which being the case," conceded my husband, "it behooves me even once more, I should say, to tell Alan John that the next time he speaks about moving on I shall hide his clothes. Certainly I haven't trusted him yet with even a quarter. He's so extraordinarily fussy about thinking that he ought to clear out." It was just at that moment that the telephone rang. I decided to answer it myself for some reason from the instrument upstairs in my own room rather than from the library. A minute's delay, and I held the transmitter to my lips. "Yes?" I called. "Is this Mrs. Jack Delville?" queried the voice. "Yes. Who's speaking?" "It's Alan John," said the voice. "Why, Alan John," I laughed, "of course it would be you. We were just speaking about you, and that's always the funny way that things happen. But wherever in the world are you? We'd begun to worry a bit." "I'm in town," said Alan John. "In town!" I cried. "Town! How did you get there?" In Alan John's voice, suddenly, it was as though tone itself was fashion. "That's what I want to tell you," said Alan John. "I've done a horrid thing, a regular kid college boy sort of thing. I've taken something from your house, that silver salt cellar, you know, that I forgot to give back, and left it with a man in the village as a security for the price of a railroad ticket to town, and a telegram to my brother, and this phone message. I didn't have a cent, you know. But the instant I hear from my brother—" "Why, you silly!" I cried. "Why didn't you speak to my husband?" "Oh, your husband," said Alan John, just a bit dryly, "would have given me the whole house, but he wouldn't let me leave it. And it was quite time I was leaving." The voice quickened sharply. "I had to leave some time, you know, and all of a sudden I had to leave at once. Rollins, you know, his break about the little girl. After young Kenilworth's cubishness, I simply couldn't put another slight on that lovely little girl. But," his voice was all grey and again spent like ashes, "but I just couldn't play," he said. "Not that." "Why, of course you couldn't play," I cried. "Nobody expected you to. Rollins is a horror." "Oh, Rollins is all right enough," said Alan John. "It's life that is the horror." "Yes, but Alan John," I parried. "You people have been angels to me," he interrupted me sharply. "I shall never forget it. Nor the lovely little girl. I'm going back to Montana to see how my ranch looks. I can't talk now, not to anybody. For God's sake, don't call anybody. But if I get straightened out again, ever, you'll hear from me. And if I don't—" "But Alan John," I protested, "everybody will be desolated, you're going off like this. Why, you're not even equipped in the simplest way. Not a single bit of baggage, not a personal possession. Across the buzzing wires it seemed suddenly as though I could actually hear Alan John making one last really desperate effort to smile. "I've got my little silver whistle," said Alan John, as though in confirmation of the fact he lifted the silver bauble to his lips and blew a single fluty note across the 60 miles. "Goodbye," he said. Before I had fairly dropped the receiver back into its place, the May girl was at my elbow. Her lovely childish eyes were strangely alert, her radiant head cocked ever so slightly to one side, as though she held a shell to her listening ear, but there was no shell in her hand. "What was that?" cried the May girl. "I thought I heard Alan John's whistle." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Rainy Week by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jenny McCann. Were you ever in a theater, right in the middle of a play, on the very verge of an act that you were really quite curious about, and just as the curtain started to go up it was suddenly yanked down again instead, and a woman behind the scenes screamed, oh horridly, and a man came rushing out in front of the curtain waving his arms and trying to tell everybody something, but everybody all of a sudden was so busy screaming for himself that even God, I think, couldn't have made you hear just what the trouble was? It isn't a pleasant thing to have happen. But that is almost exactly what happened to our Rainy Week play on this the 4th night of events, just as I was waiting for the curtain to rise on the most carefully staged scene which we had prepared, the scene designated as the bungalow on the rocks, and the woman who screamed was the May girl, and the man who came rushing back to try and explain was Rollins, and the May girl, it proved, was screaming because she was drowning. And if it hadn't been for the silly little palm dog that Claude Kenilworth had been silly enough to bring way from New York for a week's outing at the seashore, just to please the extraordinarily silly girl who occupied the studio next to his, the May girl would have drowned. It makes one feel almost afraid to move somehow, or even not to move for that matter, afraid to be silly indeed, or even not to be silly, lest it foil or foul in some bungling way the plot of life which the biggest dramatist of all had really intended. It was Ann Walter who gave the only adequate explanation. Everybody had at least pretended that night the unalterable intention of going to bed early. Claude Kenilworth, of course, having absented himself from the breakfast table, didn't know anything about the bungalow discussion, but pique alone at the May girl's persistent yet totally unexcited rebuff of his patronage had retired him earlier than anyone to the seclusion of his own room. And Rollins's unhappy propensity of always and forever butting into other people's plans had been most efficiently thwarted, as far as we could see, by dragging him upstairs and slamming his nose into a brand new and very profusely illustrated tome on the subject of the violet snail. By 10:30, Ann Walter confessed she had found the whole lower part of the house apparently deserted. For the same reason, best known even yet only to herself, she was still very anxious, it appeared, to get to the bungalow before any of her house companions should have forestalled her. The trip, I judged, had not proved unduly hard. By the aid of a pocket flashlight she had made the descent of the cliff without accident, and after a single confusion where a blind trail ended in the water, discovered the jagged path that twisted along the ledge to the very door of the bungalow. Once in the bungalow, she had dallied only long enough to search out, by the aid of the flashlight, the particular object or objects which she had come for. Startled by a little sound, the sound of a man humming a little French tune that she hadn't heard for 15 years, she had grabbed up her treasure, whatever it was, and bolted precipitously for the house, not knowing she had sprung the trap of our concealed phonograph when she opened the door. Even once back in the safe precincts of the house, however, she was further startled and completely upset by running into the May girl. The May girl was on the stairs, it seemed, just coming down, and she didn't look quite right, Ann Walter admitted. That is, she looked almost as though she was walking in her sleep, or a bit dazed, a bit bewildered, and certainly, dressed as she was, just a filmy nightgown with her warm blanket wrapper merely lashed across her shoulders by its sleeves, her pretty feet bare, her gauzy hair floating like an aura all around her, It certainly wasn't to be supposed that she was just starting off on a prankish endeavour to solve the bungalow mystery. Even her eyes looked unreal to Ann Walter. Even her voice, when she spoke, sounded more than a little bit queer. I thought I heard Alan John whistle," she said. I promised, you know, that if he ever needed me, I'd come." Ann Walter nearly collapsed. "Nonsense!" she explained. "Alan John is in town. Don't you remember? He telephoned while we were at supper. Mrs. Delville delivered his messages and good-byes to us." "Why, yes, of course," roused the May girl almost instantly. "How silly! I guess I must have been asleep, and just dreamed it." "Why, of course you were asleep and just dreamed it," Ann Walter assured her. "You're asleep now. Get back to bed before you catch your death of cold, or before anybody sees you." Ann Walter, on the verge of hysterics herself, quite naturally was not at all anxious that those dazed, bewildered eyes should clear suddenly and with inevitable questioning upon her own distinctly drenched and most windblown and generally dishevelled appearance. A single little shove of the shoulders had proved enough to herd the May girl back to her bedroom, while she herself had escaped undetected to her own quarters. But the May girl had not been satisfied, it appeared, with Ann Walter's assurances concerning Alan John. An hour later or more, roused once again to a still somewhat dazed, but now unalterable conviction that Alan John had whistled, and fully equipped this time to combat whatever opposition or weather she might meet, she crept from the house out into the storm, with the little palm dog sniffing at her heels. Just what happened afterwards nobody knows. Just how it happened, or exactly when it happened, nobody can even guess. Maybe it was the brilliantly lighted bungalow my husband had fixed for the setting of the bungalow scene, just after Ann Walter's surreptitious visit, that incited her. Maybe, to a mind already stricken with feverishness, the rising tide did suck through the bungalow rocks with a sound that faintly suggested a rather specially agonized sort of whistle. Who can say? The fact remains that to all intents and purposes she seemed to have ignored the ledge that even yet, in spite of its drenching spray, would have been perfectly safe for another half-hour at least, and plunged forth down the blind trail, off the rocks, into the water below. Resolutely she refused to cry for help. Perhaps the shock of the cold water chilled the cry in her throat. She grasped the slippery seaweed clinging to the rocks, moaning a little, crying a little, the pitiful struggle setting the palm dog nearly crazy. How long she clung there she couldn't tell. She was mauled and bruised by the threshing waves. Still some complex inhibition prevented her crying out for help. Ages passed. Her bruised arms and numb fingers refused to hold the grip on the elusive seaweed forever, and she eventually let go her hold. A receding wave took her and tossed her poor, exhausted body, still struggling against another ledge of rock well out of reach from shore. Then, for the first time, the May girl seemed to realize fully her peril, and she shrieked for help. Ann Walter, rousing sluggishly from her sleep, heard the black palm dog barking furiously on the beach. Reluctant at first to leave her snug bed, it must have been several minutes at least before sheer curiosity and irritation drove her to get up and peer from the window. Out of that murky blackness, of course, not a single outline of the little dog met her sight. Just that incessant yap yap, yap yap of a tiny creature almost frenzied with excitement. But what really smote Ann Walter's startled vision, and for the first time, was the flare of lights which made the bungalow seem as if ablaze. And as she stared aghast into that flare of light which seemed to point so accusingly at her across the intervening waters, she either sensed or saw the May girl's unmistakable head and shoulders banging into the single craggy rock that still jutted up from the depths, saw an arm reach out, heard that one blood-curdling scream. Rollins must have thought she was mad, dragging him from his bed, with her arms around his neck, her lips crushed to his ear. Even then she could hardly articulate or make a sound louder than a whisper. Rollins, fortunately, did not lose his voice. Rollins bellowed. Rushing out into the hall just as he was, pajamas, nightcap and all, Rollins lifted his voice like a baying hound. In a moment all hands were on deck. My husband rushed for the dory, George Keats with him, Paul Brunswick, Kenilworth, Rollins. The women huddled on the beach. "Hold on," we shouted into space. "Just a minute more, just 1 minute more." We might just as well have shouted into a sawdust pile. The wind took the words and rammed them down our throats again till we sickened and choked. Young Kenilworth came running. He was still in his white flannels. He looked like a ghost. "There's been some hitch about the oars," he cried. "Is she still there?" In the flare of our lantern light I turned suddenly and stared at him. He looked so queer. In a moment so awful, it seemed almost incredible that any human face could have summoned so much ego into it. From those gay, pleasure-roaming feet, it must have come hurtling suddenly, that expression. From those facile, self-assured fingertips that were already coaxing the secrets of line and form from the Creator. From that lusty, hot-blooded young heart that was even now accumulating its pasts. From the arrogant, brilliant young brain that knew only too well that it had a future. And even as I watched, young Kenilworth stripped the white flannels from his body, and the pleasure, and the triumph, and all the little pasts, and all the one big future. And he who had come so presumptuously to us to make an infinitesimal bronze replica of the sea, went forth very humbly from us to make a man-sized model of sacrifice. For an instant only, as he studied for the plunge, a flash of the old mockery crossed his face. "Of course I'm stronger than the ocean," he called back, "but if it shouldn't prove so, don't forget my old man's birthday." Ann Walter fainted as his slim body struck the waves. Hours passed, ages, eons, before the dory reached them, yet my husband says that it was only minutes. By the merciful providence of darkness we were at least spared some of the visual stages of that struggle. Minutes or eons, there were not even seconds to spare, it proved, by the time help actually arrived. Claude Kenilworth had a broken arm, but was at least conscious. The May girl looked as though she would never be conscious again. Against the ghastly pallor of her skin the brutal bruises loomed like love's last offering of violets. The flexible fingertips had clawed themselves to pulp and blood. The village doctor came on the wings of the wind. We telephoned Dr. Braun, but he was away on a business trip somewhere and could not be located. The rest of the night went by like a brand new battle for life, but in the full glare of lamplight this time. By breakfast time, if one can compute hours so on a morning when nobody eats, Claude Kenilworth was almost himself again. But the May girl's vitality failed utterly to rally. White as the linen that encompassed her, she lay in that dreadful stupor among her pillows. Only once she roused herself to any attempt at speech, and even then her words were almost inaudible. "Alan John," she struggled to say, "was trying to find him." "Has she had any shock before this?" puzzled the doctor. "Any recent calamity? Any special threat of impending illness?" "She fainted day before yesterday," was all the information anybody could proffer. "She is subject to fainting spells, it seems. Last night Miss Walter thought she looked a little bit dazed, as though with a touch of fever." "We've got to rouse her some way," said the doctor. "Oh, if we could only find Alan John!" cried the bride. "Alan John and his whistle," she supplemented with almost shamefaced playfulness. My husband and George Keats tore off to town in the little car. They raked the streets, the hotels, the telegraph offices, the railroad station, God knows what, before they found him, but they did find him. That's all that really matters. It was 10 o'clock at night before they all reached home again. Alan John asked only one question as he crossed the threshold. His forehead was puckered with perplexity. "Is everybody in the world going to die?" he said. They took him directly to the May girl's room and put him down in a chair just opposite her bed, with the whistle in his hands. Spring and youth and the pipes of Pan, but such a sorry Pan. All the youth that was left in him seemed to have been wrung out anew by this latest horror. In the greyness of him, the hopelessness, the pain, he might have been 50, 60 himself, instead of the scant 28 or 30 years that he doubtless was. A little bit shakily he lifted the whistle to his lips. "Not that I put a great deal of credence in it," admitted the doctor, "but if you say it was a sound, a signal that she had been waiting for." Softly Alan John fluted the silver note. A little shiver, a struggle, passed across the figure on the bed. "Again," prompted the doctor. Once more Alan John lifted the whistle to his lips. The May girl opened her eyes and struggled vainly to raise herself on her elbow. When she saw Ellen John, a vague sort of astonishment flushed across her face, and an odd apologetic little laugh slipped weakly from her lips. I came just as soon as I could, Ellen John," she said, and sinking back into her pillows began quite unexpectedly to cry. It was the doctor himself who sat by her side and wiped her tears away. Ann Walter shared the watches with me through the rest of the night. Ellen John never left the room. Towards dawn I sent even Ann Walter to her sleep, and Ellen John and I met the new day alone. By the time it was really light, the May girl, weak as she was, seemed to have recovered a certain amount of talkativeness. Recognizing thoroughly the presence and activity of both my hands and my feet, she seemed to ignore entirely the existence of either my eyes or my ears. Her puzzled wonderments were directed at Ellen John alone. "Ellen John, Ellen John," I heard her call softly. "Yes," said Ellen John. "It's a lie," said the May girl. "What people say about drowning, that as you go down you remember every little teeny-weeny thing that has ever happened to you in your life. All your past, I mean. All the dreadful, wicked things that you've ever done. Oh, it's an awful lie." "Is it?" said Ellen John. "Yes, it certainly is," attested the May girl. "Why, I never even remembered the day I bit my grandmother." "No?" shivered Ellen John. "No, indeed," insisted the May girl. "The only things that I thought of were the things I had planned to do. The plans that were drowning with me. One of them," she flushed suddenly, "one of the plans, I mean, I didn't seem to care at all when I saw it go down, and the plan about going to Europe sometime. Oh, I don't think that suffered so terribly. But the farm I was planning to have, the cows, the horses, the dogs, the chickens, the rabbits. Why, Ellen John, I counted 17 rabbits." Very softly to herself she began to cry again. "Shh, shh," cautioned Ellen John. "Things that have never happened, you know, can't die." "Of that," reflected the May girl through her tears, "I am not so perfectly sure. Is it going to clear up?" she asked quite irrelevantly. "Oh, yes, surely," rallied Ellen John. He would have told her it was Christmas, I think, if he had really thought that that was what she wanted him to say. Very expeditiously, instead, he began to shine up the silver whistle with the corner of his handkerchief. With an almost amusing solemnity, the May girl lay and watched the proceeding. Under the heavy fringe of her lashes, her eyes looked very shy. Then, so gently, so childishly, that even Ellen John didn't wince till it was all over, she asked him the question that no other person in the world probably could have asked him at that moment and lived. "Ellen John," she asked, "do you suppose that you will ever marry again?" "Oh, my God, no!" gasped Ellen John. "Men do," mused the May girl. "Men do," conceded Ellen John. With the sweat starting on his brow, he jumped up and strode to the window. From the window he turned back slowly with a curious look of perplexity on his face. "Why do you ask that?" he said. "Oh, I don't know," said the May girl. "I was just wondering," she sighed. "Wondering what?" said Ellen John. "Wondering," mused the May girl, "if you would ever want to marry me." For a moment Ellen John did not seem to understand. For a moment he gazed aghast at the May girl's impassive face. "Why, child," he stammered. "Why, honey, dear," I intercepted wildly. It was the strangest wooing I ever saw or dreamed of. The wooing by a person who didn't even know she was wooing, of a person who didn't even know he was being wooed. "Well, all right, perhaps it doesn't matter," said the May girl. "I was only thinking how sad it would be if Alan John ever did need me for his wife and I was already married to somebody else." When the doctor came at noon, he reported with eminent satisfaction a decided improvement in both his patients. Claude Kenilworth, contrary to one's natural expectations, was proving himself an ideal patient despite his painful injury, which he steadfastly refused to acknowledge. Even the May girl's more subtle and mystifying complications seemed to have cleared up most astonishingly, he felt, since his previous visit. "Oh, she's coming out all right," he assured us. "Fresh air, plenty of range, freedom from all emotional concern or distress," were the keynotes of his advice. "She's only a baby, grown woman-sized in an all too brief 18 years," he averred. Words, phrases, judgments rioted only too confusedly through my mind that was already so inordinately perplexed with the whole chaotic situation. As I said good-bye and turned back from the front door, I was surprised to see both my husband and Ann Walters standing close beside me. The constrained expressions on their faces startled me. "You heard what the doctor said," I exclaimed. "You heard his exact words. 'Great big overgrown baby,' he said, 'ought to be turned out to play in a sand pile for at least 2 years more.' Just a baby," I protested, "and she'll be tending her own babies before the 2 years are over. They are planning to marry her in September, you know, to a man old enough to be her grandfather, almost. To Dr. Braun," I stormed. "To whom?" gasped Ann Walter. Her face was suddenly livid. "To whom?" A horrid chill went through me. "What's Dr. Braun to you?" I asked. "It's time you told her," interposed my husband quietly. "What is Dr. Braun to you?" I demanded. "Dr. Braun? Nothing," cried Ann Walter. "But the girl is my girl, my own little girl, my own big little girl." "What?" I gasped. "What?" As though my knees had turned to straw, I sank into the nearest chair. With the curious exultancy of a long strain finally relaxed, I saw Ann Walter's immobile face flame suddenly with amusement. "Did you think I was talking just weather with your husband all that first harrowing day and evening? In the car? In the bungalow? Oh no, not weather," she exclaimed. "Not even just the May girl, as you call her, but everything. Your husband discovered it that first morning in the car," she annotated hurriedly. "I dropped my watch. It had a picture in it, a picture of May taken last year. Dr. Braun sent it to me." "Yes, but Dr. Braun?" I puzzled. "Oh, I knew that May was to be married," she frowned, "and to a man a good deal older than herself. Dr. Braun wrote me that, but what he quite neglected to mention," once again the frown deepened, "was that the old man was himself. I like Dr. Braun. He is a very brilliant man, but I certainly do not approve of him as my daughter's husband. There are reasons. One need not go into them now," she acknowledged. "At least they do not specially concern his age. My daughter would hardly be happy with a boy, I think. Boys do not usually like simplicity. It takes a mature man to appreciate simplicity." "Yes, but the discovery," I fretted. "Your own discovery. Just when?" "In the train, of course, coming down that first night," cried Ann Walter. "I thought I should go mad. I thought at every station I would jump off. And then Rollins's bungling remark the next day about my tooth gave me the chance, as I suppose, to get away. Except for that awkward accident to my watch, I should have gotten away. Your husband implored me for my own sake, for everyone's sake, to stop and consider. There was so much to consider. I had all my proofs with me, my letters, my papers, my marriage certificate. We went to the bungalow. We thrashed it all out. I was still mad to get away. I had no other wish in the world except to get away. Your husband persuaded me that my duty was here, to watch my girl, to get acquainted with my girl, before I even so much as attempted meeting my other problems. I was very rattled. I left my broken watch in the bungalow. The picture was still in it. That's why I went back. I wasn't sure even then that I would disclose my identity even to my daughter. For that reason alone, I made your husband promise that he would not betray my secret even to you. If I decided to tell, all right, but I wish no such decision forced upon me." "Oh, Anne, dear," I cried, "don't tell me any more. You've suffered enough. Just Rollins's bungling alone. The impudence of him." "Rollins? Rollins?" intercepted that pestiferous gentleman's voice suddenly. "Do I hear my name bandied by festive voices?" In another moment the pest himself stood beside us. My husband is by no means a swearing man, but I distinctly heard from his unwonted lips at that moment a muttered blasphemy that would make a stevedore blush for shame. Despite all her terrible stress and strain, Ann Walters smiled, actually smiled. My husband gasped. The cause of that gasp was only too evident. Once again we saw Rollins's ominous gaze fixed with unalterable intent on Ann Walter's face. What was meant to be an ingratiating smile quickened suddenly in his eyes. "Truly, Miss Walter," he said, "tell me, why don't you get it fixed?" For an instant I thought Ann Walter would scream. For an instant I thought Ann Walter would faint. Then, quicker than chain lightning, right there before our eyes, we saw her make her great decision. It was as though her brain was glass, and we could see its every working. "All right," said Ann Walter very quietly, "all right. You damn fool, I will tell you. I will tell everybody." For the first time in his life I saw Rollins stagger. But Rollins could not remain prostrate even under such a rebuff as this. "Why, thank you. Thank you very much," he rallied, with his first returning breath. Shall I call the others?" "By all means, call them quickly," said Ann Walter. "Oh, Anne," I protested. "I mean it," she said. Her face was strangely quiet. "The time has come. I've made up my mind at last." From the door of the porch we heard Rollins's piping voice. "Mr. Brenswick, Mr. Keats, Kenilworth, Alan John, come on. Miss Walter's going to tell us a story." With vaguely responsive interest the people came trooping in. "A story?" brightened the bride. "Oh, lovely. What is it about?" "The story of my broken tooth," said Ann Walter very trenchantly. "Told by request, Mr. Rollins's request," she added. With a single comprehensive glance at my tortured face, at my husband's, at Ann Walter's, Claude Kenilworth turned sharply on his heel and started to leave the room. "What, don't you want to hear the story?" piped Rollins. "No, not by a damn sight," snapped Kenilworth. "But I want you to hear it," said Ann Walter, still in that deadly quiet but absolutely firm voice. George Keats's lips were drawn suddenly to a mere thin, white line. "One has no desire to intrude, Miss Walter," he protested. "It is no intrusion," said Ann Walter. For a single hesitating moment her somber eyes swept the waiting group. Then, without further break or pause, she plunged into her narrative. "I am the May girl's mother," she said. "I ran away from the May girl's father. I ran away with another man. I don't pretend to explain it. I don't pretend to condone it. This is not a discussion of ethics, but a mere statement of history. All that I insist upon your understanding is that I ran away from a legalized life of incessant fault-finding and criticism to an unlegalized life of absolute approval and love. I cannot even admit, after the first big wrench, of course, that I greatly regretted the little child I left behind. Mothers are always supposed to regret such things, I know, but I was not perhaps a normal mother. I suffered, of course, but it was a suffering that I could stand. I could not stand, it seems, the suffering of living with my child's father. My husband followed us after a few months, not so much for outraged love, I think, as for vindictiveness. We met in a cafe, the three of us. My husband and my lover were both cool-blooded men. My lover was a Quaker, who had never yet lifted his hand against any man. The two men started arguing. I came of a hot-blooded family. I had never seen men arguing only about a woman before. More than that, I was vain. I was foolish. The biggest portrait painter of the hour had chosen me for what he considered would be his masterpiece. I taunted my lover and my husband with the fact that neither of them loved me. John Stolter struck my husband. It was the first blow. My husband made a furious attack on him. I tried to intervene. He struck me instead with such damage as you note. Enraged beyond all sanity at the sight, John Stolter killed him. Even then, so overwrought as I was, so bewildered with my mouth all cut and bleeding, I snatched up a mirror to gauge the extent of my ruin. John Stolter spoke to me, the only harsh words of his life. "Your damage can be repaired in an hour," he said, "but mine, never." It was at that moment they took him away. Almost 15 years it has been. He did not have to pay the extreme penalty. There were extenuating circumstances, the judge thought. His time expires next month. I am waiting for him. I have been waiting for 15 years. At least he will see that I have subjugated my vanity. I swore that I would never mend my damage until I could help him mend his. With a little gesture of fatigue she turned to Rollins. "This is the story of the broken tooth," she finished, quite abruptly. Wasn't Alan John even listening, I thought? With everyone else's eyes fairly glued to Ann Walter's arresting face, even now, at the supreme climax of her narrative, his eyes seemed focused far away. Instinctively I followed his gaze. At the top of the stairs, her arms holding tight to the banisters for support, sat the May girl. In the almost breathless moment that ensued, Rollins swallowed twice, only too audibly. "All the same," insisted Rollins, hesitatingly, "all the same, I really do think that—" With a little cry that might have meant almost anything, the bride jumped up suddenly and threw her arms around Ann Walter's neck. Even at twilight time everybody was still discussing the problem of the May girl. Certainly there was plenty of problem to discuss. The question of an innocent young girl on the very verge of her young womanhood. The question of a practically unknown mother. The question of a shattered, unrelated man coming fresh to them from 15 years in prison. The question even of Dr. Braun. Everybody had his or her own impractical or unsatisfactory solution to suggest. Everybody, that is, except Alan John. Alan John, as usual, had nothing to say. Upstairs, in the privacy of her own room, Ann Walter and the May girl, without undue emotion, were very evidently threshing out the problem for themselves. Yet when they came down and joined us just before supper time, it was only too evident from their tired faces that they had reached no happier conclusion than ours. George Keats and my husband brought the May girl down. Claude Kenilworth, quite in his old form, save for his splinted arm, superintended the expedition. "It's her being so beastly long," scolded Kenilworth, "that makes the job so hard." In the depths of the big leather chair the May girl didn't look very long to me, but she did look astonishingly frail. With a gesture of despair, Ann Walter turned to her companions as if she had read our thoughts. "There isn't any solution," she said. Why all of us turned just then to Alan John I don't know, but it became perfectly evident to everyone at that moment that Alan John was about to speak. "It seems quite clear to me," said Alan John simply. "It seems quite natural to me somehow," he added, "that you should all come home with me to my ranch in Montana. The little girl needs it, the big outdoors, the animals, the life she craves. You need it," he said, turning to Ann Walter, "the peace of it, the balm of it. But most of all John Stalter will need it when it is time for him to come. Far from prying eyes, safe from intrusive questionings, that certainly will be the perfect chance for you all to plan out your new lives together. How much it would mean to me not to have to go back alone, I need not say." Startled at his insight, compelled by his sincerity, Ann Walter saw order dawn suddenly out of the chaos of her emotions. From her frankly quivering lips a single protest wavered. "But Alan John," she cried, "you've only known us 4 days." Across Alan John's haggard face flickered the faintest possible suggestion of a smile. "I was a stranger, and you took me in." With the weirdest possible sense of supernatural benediction, the dark room flooded suddenly with light. From the window just beyond me, I heard my husband's astonished exclamation. "Look, Mary," he cried, "come quickly." At an instant I was at his side. Across the murky western sky the tumultuous storm clouds had broken suddenly into silver and gold. In a blaze of glory the setting sun fairly streamed into our faces. Struggling up from the depths of her chair to view it, even the May girl's pallid cheeks caught up their share of the radiance. "Oh, Alan John," she laughed, "just see what you have done. You've shined up all the world." With a curiously significant expression on his face, my husband leaned toward me quickly. "Ring down the curtain quick," he whispered. "The play's done. Rainy week is over." End of chapter 6. End of Rainy Week by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott.